This lecture review video examines 19th century industrialism and its corresponding artistic movement, Romanticism. The Industrial Revolution of the 19th century is one of the great turning points in European history, but also all of world history. For thousands of years, humans were primarily focused on agriculture and very small manufacturing, such as blacksmiths and also furniture making. But what we witness in the 19th century is an explosion of new inventions, large machines, very large factories that house these machines, and an enormous output of new goods and products that completely transformed the way that Europeans live, work, and view the world. For the first time, individuals in European history actually had to go to work as opposed to remain on the farm where they lived. Thus, we can divide the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century really into two industrial revolutions. The first Industrial Revolution we can date somewhere at the middle of the 1700s and extending all the way to the middle of the 19th century. The first Industrial Revolution was primarily centered in Great Britain and focused on textile manufacturers. The Second Industrial Revolution began somewhere around 1850, and perhaps we could date the end of its time, 1914, with the beginning of World War I. The Second Revolution was primarily focused in Germany and involved many larger industrial products, including the production of coal, iron, and chemicals and steel. Thus, examining the first Industrial Revolution, there are many reasons why it emerged in Great Britain and not other countries. Great Britain had an experience with other European countries, an agricultural revolution, in which there's an abundance of agricultural goods that for the first time Europeans are really feeding themselves. There's actually a surplus of food. There's also a great supply of capital or money in Great Britain, and which provides a lot of fluidity in the economy for entrepreneurs and businessmen to build mills and build larger machines. There's also a great age of discovery and entrepreneurs and many inventors in England and Scotland who are tackling the great questions of the age and achieving great success in doing so. A central bank established by the government also oversaw the nation's money supply, and a natural abundance of mineral resources in the British Isles were very important, including wool and coal and oil to come. There's also a great geography to Great Britain that included rivers and roads and mountains, and of course being an island, being surrounded by the sea, provided a natural highway to connect to the continent and the larger world. The biggest reason why Great Britain experiences the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century is probably because they had a stable and free government. You remember the constitutional questions, particularly the supremacy of the Parliament and limiting the power of the monarchy, was achieved in the 17th century with the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution and the establishment of the English Bill of Rights. Therefore, as much of Europe is consumed with questions of revolution and stabilizing their governments and putting down revolts throughout the 19th century, Great Britain, because they had already resolved all these questions in the 17th century, is able to focus on investment, entrepreneurship, and also invention. As a result, the great products produced in Great Britain in the First Industrial Revolution are able to be sent to many markets on the European continent and around the world. Thus, we can see on this map the abundance of canals and navigable rivers that were important, that provided really an early superhighway system for connecting the island of England to Wales and also Scotland. There was also a great abundance of coal and iron ore deposits across the British Isles, and therefore England is also the starting point for the construction of railroads and larger rail lines, which are of course going to be very important in the First Industrial Revolution, connecting the country and moving raw materials and also finished goods. Therefore, England becomes the center and really the dominant power regarding the development of textiles in the 19th century. It may not seem like a lot to us, the development of machines that can sew and weave thread into fabrics, but textiles are very important in launching the First Industrial Revolution, proving to Europeans the capability of machines, and then those ideas behind those machines are, of course, expanded and directed towards other industrial efforts. Thus, what we see in 19th century English is an explosion of inventions that center on making the process of clothes a lot easier than it had been for thousands of years before, whereas everything was custom made, handmade, individually made for thousands of years. The first industrial revolution enables inventors to speed up the process and produce a far number of goods. Instrumental to that was a series of important inventions. This includes Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin, which greatly expedited the process of removing seeds from long, staple, sticky cotton, and thus provided cotton as a readily used product for the development of textiles. Thus, British textile manufacturers become very heavily dependent on the American South for the development of cotton, and then later its very valuable colony of India. We also see the development of the spinning jenny, invented by James Hargreaves, which spun raw wool into thread. The development of the water frame by Richard Arkwright, which could be connected to a water wheel of a local mill. The spinning mule, which was instrumental in spinning the thread into cloth. Also the flying shuttle, which was added to some of the previous machines. And then gradually all of these ideas are put together in the power loom developed by Edmund Cartwright, which could very quickly weave thread into cloth. As we mentioned, so much of textile manufacturing for thousands of years was done in the home, custom made individually for each family. But gradually what we see in the emergence of the 19th century is what we can call cottage industries, in which perhaps most of the production of clothes are produced in the home. Perhaps part of them are gradually moved out to a small local mill and produced and finished on a larger scale. Or perhaps the process worked in reverse, in which raw wool could be spun into thread and then they would be woven into cloth in the home. This is sometimes called the putting out system, in which the process was started in a mill and then put out to homes in the local area where it could be completed. Gradually, the process of spinning and weaving thread and producing a finished textile product are all incorporated into a local building that we identify as a mill. A mill was very important to be stationed along a flowing waterway, because the waterway would power the water wheel and thus provide some motion for machines inside of the mill. Very important was the invention of the steam engine by the Scotsman James Watt. Whereas so much textile production was exclusively dependent on water power before the invention of the steam engine, the invention of the steam engine, with its pressurized boiler and moving piston, provided a new source of power that no longer required mills to necessarily be built and placed alongside a local water source. Gradually, James Watt's idea of the steam engine is expanded to become a much larger operation, and these larger steam engines are incorporated into larger buildings that become factories that replace the local small mills. Inside of these factories, we see the development of very large spinning machines and also power looms, which become more complex, loud, crowded, and require less and less human intervention to keep them running. Thus, Great Britain becomes the centerpiece for textile production by the end of the 18th century and into the beginning of the 19th century. These are important state secrets, and the government of Great Britain is very focused on guarding its early successes in the Industrial Revolution. Besides textiles in the first Industrial Revolution, we also see the rediscovery of cement. It is William Aspdin who rediscovers the recipe for the construction of cement. Now, mortar had been used back in the classical period of Greece and Rome, but the recipe had been lost for much of the medieval period. So it's this Englishman who rediscovers a new recipe for cement, and The value of cement is, of course, extraordinary, including the development of tunnels, including the Thames Tunnel, which was a tunnel that went under the Thames River and connected both sides of London by this walkway underneath the tunnel. And then gradually, of course, the introduction of trains in these tunnels, which would be the subway. And of course, London is the first city in the world to have a subway. We also see new in discoveries and new processes in metallurgy during the first industrial revolution, in which charcoal or more refined forms of charcoal, coke, and coal are used to produce various types of iron, including pig iron and wrought iron, which becomes very strong substances that also are very malleable and can be made into rail lines and also supports for bridges. Very important developments. Also in machining tools, boring machines, screw cutting lathes, milling machines, tool and die machines, which provide stronger iron tools in order to work with metallurgy and therefore provide stronger products as well. During the first industrial revolution, in order to connect mills and also deliver finished products to markets, Great Britain invests heavily in the development and digging of canals. Canals, of course, are useful for connecting smaller rivers and rivulets together. To overcome the obstacles of topography, sometimes the construction of locks are necessary, in which locks essentially act like a water elevator to move a boat from one surface to another without having to offload the goods. The most famous canal is constructed in the Suez Canal, constructed in 1869, developed by the French engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps. Of course, the journey to get from London all the way to its valuable colony of India before the construction of the canal was 12,300 miles. Once the Suez Canal is dug, it would allow ships from London to pass through the Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal, and then through the Red Sea, and accomplishing the trip to India in only 7,200 miles. Thus, it was enormously fast. The Suez Canal wasn't particularly difficult to dig. It certainly didn't meet the challenges that the construction of the Panama Canal would encounter about 100 years later. Thus, the developments in metallurgy and ironworking are very important for the construction of larger bridges across the British Isles, connecting roads and also traversing larger rivers, and eventually the development of rails for the coming of the railroad. It is the English inventor Richard Trevithick who is instrumental in developing the first locomotive, in which he essentially takes James Watt's steam engine, places it on a carriage, mounts it on rails, and then, providing a safe boiler, is able to provide locomotion to pull carts forward in a primitive railroad. George Stephenson provides some refinements in expanding the locomotive, adding speed and also power. And thus we have, in 1830, the first inaugural journey of the Liverpool-Manchester Railway, which was the first ever commercial railway line that reached top breathtaking speeds of 30 miles an hour. Gradually, the first industrial revolution, although it begins in Great Britain, gradually begins to expand to the continent. And we see the expansion of railroads, particularly in Western Europe, much slowly as we head east, with Russia not receiving the development of its first railway until 1851. Also, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, we see the emergence of a new working class in Great Britain and two classes of individuals that we can identify as the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie, in many ways, is the middle class, businessmen, factory owners, investors who pool their money together to build a mill and finance the construction of machines, hire workers to produce textiles or other manufactured goods. The bourgeoisie, in some ways, become the earliest capitalists and also one of the richest classes in Great Britain, and in many quarters replacing the old aristocracies whose roles and wealth were based on birth and privilege. Bourgeoisie hires members of the working class to work in their mills and factories that become known as the proletariat. The proletariat generally lived right around the poverty line or slightly above it, And the proletariat was always concerned with increasing the amount of their wages, improving their working conditions, and also reducing the number of hours that they had to work in local mills and factories. We also see the development, unfortunately, in the first industrial revolution of child labor. Originally, there are no laws that prevent small children from working long hours in mines and also dirty, noisy, congested, dangerous factories. Gradually, Parliament passes a series of acts that starts to regulate these conditions and also limit the workday to 10 hours, and also prohibiting very small children from working in mines. And then also, a lot of this labor legislation starts to benefit women as well, preventing them from working over 10 hours a day. And also, one of these acts that are important passed by Parliament is the Trade Union Act, which prevented combinations, that is, trade unions, that workers couldn't come together and collectively bargain. This is going to be the beginning of a long labor struggle for the English working class that is going to extend well into the 20th century. Thus, the first industrial revolution that begins in the British Isles gradually does expand to Western Europe as we see the development of canals and roads and also railways and also textile machines and additional inventions. But it is clear that the United Kingdom has a certain advantage at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and by the middle of the 19th century clearly dominates Europe as far as industrial output. That begins to change right around mid-century with the development of an introduction of the country of Germany, the proclamation of the German Empire in 1871. And it is in Germany that we see the beginnings of the Second Industrial Revolution, which we can date roughly from 1850 and then continuing all the way up until the First World War. German industrialism is a little bit different than British industrialism. There's new attention to large plants and factories that focus on innovation and invention. Germany introduces laws against cartels, which were combinations of various manufacturers that would often set prices and raise them quite high for their own benefit working together. These laws eliminated that type of cartel competition. Germany is also focused on developing chemical laboratories that would provide research and development for new industrial products, and they also introduced some of the first technical schools, including the PhD degree for research in advanced industrial matters. Thus, we can see by mid-century, it is clear that the industrial output in Germany is really taking off and inspiring the rest of Europe to move away from simply manufacturers to focus on more heavy industrial products. So some of the characteristics of the Second Industrial Revolution include a greater attention to larger, heavier, longer trains, the expansion of railroads, the production of larger factories that reach greater production, also huge profits for business tycoons that own these factories. We see the development of stronger labor unions that are more aggressive in representing workers' rights, the development of electricity, communications, advances in transportation, and a new focus on oil and steel and chemicals, as well as new forms of business organization during the Second Industrial Revolution. Some key inventors and inventions of the Second Industrial Revolution include Henry Bessemer's development of the Bessemer converter. The strongest substance in the world and in construction for thousands of years had been iron, but it is the Englishman Henry Bessemer that develops a process for removing the impurities and the carbon, the weaknesses, from raw iron ore, and as a result produces molten steel. Molten steel is a much stronger and easier substance to work with than iron ore. Therefore, we can mark 1850 perhaps as the beginning of the age of steel, the development of larger railways, but also the development of more industrialized weaponry, which will be used in World War I. Another Englishman of great consequence for the Second Industrial Revolution was Michael Faraday, whose experiments in electromagnetism were very important for the development of electricity, and eventually we'll see the electrification of cities, but also mills and factories, which is also fueling the expansion of the Second Industrial Revolution. Louis Pasteur, the French chemist who is instrumental in developing the process of pasteurization and identifying the threat of bacteria as a source of sickness and plague in European cities. Dmitry Mendeleev, who is a very important Russian physicist and scientist, he is credited with the development and writing down the periodic table. The periodic table, of course, is going to become very fundamental for chemists and additional research that is also going to fuel the Second Industrial Revolution. Joseph Lister, working off some of the conclusions of Louis Pasteur and his discovery of bacteria, is important for developing Listerine and also for safer and more hygienic surgical practices, as well as using phenol over patients in order to kill bacteria and provide a more hygienic environment for surgery. We also see the development at the end of the 19th century, the development of the automobile. There's great debate exactly who is responsible for the development of the automobile, and particularly the internal combustion engine. Many believe that it was Carl Benz and the development of his motor wagon in 1885. Others would ascribe the success of the first internal combustion engine and automobile to Gottlieb Daimler, both German entrepreneurs and engineers, but very instrumental in the development of the automobile, which of course will transform life in the 20th century in Europe and around the world. Also, part of the Second Industrial Revolution, we see new work being done in biology, particularly through the works of Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin had sailed extensively around the world and was particularly interested in the eastern islands off the coast of South America. And in those islands, aboard the HMS Beagle, Darwin theorized about geology and also the extinction of great mammals. What he develops, of course, is his famous theory of evolution, in which one species evolves from a previous one in a process in which he calls survival of the fittest, in which more fit organisms survive the evolutionary process and less unfit organisms fall off. This process, also known as natural selection, leads to the theory of evolution, which is going to be an issue of great debate in British churches, but is going to fundamentally change much of the way that many scientists and biologists view their craft in the 19th century, and remains a hot issue of debate still today. During the development of the First and Second Industrial Revolution, many ways of life, of course, in European society changed, and therefore there's a number of responses to industrialism that we can identify. This is a very valuable slide for summarizing those responses. Many of those responses are positive, such as the theories of Auguste Comte. Auguste Comte, in many ways, is credited as being the founder of sociology. He believed that society, in his theories, had been progressing through three different levels. The first was the theological, which he had utter disdain for, in which man is primarily superstitious. We might see this in very primitive societies, but we also may see this in Christian societies of the Middle Ages. He believed that they lived in ignorance and superstition. Gradually, the world was moving towards a more metaphysical or empirical-based understanding of the world. We see a lot of that in the Enlightenment and discovery of natural laws, and a desire to seek natural law explanations for events rather than theological or superstitious explanations. And Auguste Comte believed that the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century witnessed a new transition in man's societal development known as scientific, which he was very positive about and very optimistic about, that finally man had come into his own, and by discovering scientific explanations for all problems, man would be able to provide for a better society. We also see a positive response to industrialism with England's Great Exhibition of 1851. The Great Exhibition was featured in the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park. In that year, this very large structure constructed really provided a fair or a showcase for many of the inventions that had been produced in Great Britain over the course of the Industrial Revolution. This is a time of great prosperity in Great Britain, and therefore they're very proud of their industrial accomplishments. Some of the exhibits at the Great Exhibition included a jacquard loom, an envelope machine, kitchen appliances, the world's largest diamond, rare pink diamonds, a very early and primitive fax machine, daguerreotypes, which were early photographs, voting machine, pay toilets, Colt revolvers from America, barometers, and also a 16-foot telescope to view the heavens. Another significant consequence or response to industrialism is enormous population growth. This is when Europe, particularly, is recovering still its population from the Black Death of the 1300s. And what we see with this explosion of population in Europe is not a decline in the birth rate or an increase in the birth rate. This population growth is not simply because European families are having more children, but rather there's a decline in the death rate, a decline in the mortality rate. This is due to the fact that there's a decline of famines. Finally, there's a surplus of food in European society, so people aren't starving to death. There really are no major continental-wide wars from 1815 and the Congress of Vienna all the way to the outbreak of war in 1914, 99 years of relative peace across the continent. Also a decline in epidemics. A lot of that had to do with new hygienic policies introduced in European cities, including the introduction of sewers and wastewater management, and also a decline in smallpox and plague decline. Smallpox had been responsible for the deaths of 300,000 and 400,000 people each year in Europe in the 18th century. So the decline of particularly those plagues is instrumental in this decline in the death rate. The only exception to this great population growth in 19th century Europe is the Irish potato famine. Ireland remained a poor country, really a colony of Great Britain, with wealthy British landowners coming to Ireland, colonizing the island of Ireland, and employing the Irish as workers on their farms and fields. The Irish diet was heavily dependent on potatoes, and when a significant fungus or blight infects those potatoes in the mid-19th century, the consequences are devastating. 1 million Irish die from starvation and disease. Another 2 million leave the Emerald Island and go to other countries, including the United States. Thus, Ireland is the only European country with a declining population in the 19th century. Another consequence or response to industrialism is urbanization. The 19th century, particularly the end of the century, witnesses a great explosion of urban growth. Much of this urban growth is, of course, very crowded cities. It is very important for mills and factories to keep their workers close, to provide housing for them frequently, so that they are able to come to the mill or factory and work each day. So therefore, often companies not only owned the mills and the factory, but also the local housing where the workers lived and paid the factory owners rent. We see the emergence of large industrial towns in England, particularly in Manchester, in the Midlands, which becomes a significant center of cotton mill production. Also Liverpool, England, to the west of England, which becomes a very dirty and crowded but exploded city, particularly because of industrialism. Another response to industrialism or reality of urban life is explosion of cholera. Cholera is a devastating disease that takes thousands of individuals, particularly those living in poor, unhygienic, unsanitary conditions in cities and in mills. And as a result, the infection rates are very high, as well as high mortality rates, particularly for pregnant women and young children. So we can take a look at two major European cities that experienced massive growth during the 19th century and also tremendous industrialization. The first being London. With the explosion of its population in London, we also see the development of an important institution in London society, which is a London police force. It was Sir Robert Peel that came up with the idea of developing a police force for crowd control and managing often drunk or unruly members of the working class. And so members of the London police force become nicknamed the Bobbies. we'll see the emergence of police departments and also fire departments in 19th century European cities. London also is the first city in the world for the development of a subway, or what becomes known as the Tube, the London Underground, for the movement of individuals beneath ground, relieving the congestion above. The most famous train station in London is probably Waterloo Station, which witnesses thousands of passengers still each day today in London. However, with the development and very quick growth of the city, we see the development of a very unsanitary city in the 19th century. There is a lack of clean water, also a lack of procedures for the removal of wastewater, and many industrial products, industrial waste, and human and animal waste are simply dumped into the Thames River. As a result, in the very hot summer of 1858, the Thames River exudes a horrific smell because of all these industrial products and also wastewater simply dumped into this very polluted river. Therefore, one of the goals of the 19th century is therefore to clean up the river and stop this practice and remove wastewater away from the river and from public dwellings. And therefore, we see the development of some of the earliest sewers in 1859 in London beneath ground, and also the passage by Parliament in 1875 of the Public Health Act. The Public Health Act required that all new residential construction must include running water and an internal drainage system so that people are not living in filth and thus becomes harbingers of disease and additional infection. Some of the great monuments of London are constructed in the 19th century, including Trafalgar Square to commemorate Admiral Horatio Nelson's victory over Napoleon's fleet at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Also, the construction of Westminster Hall, which is where Parliament meets after the original building burned down in the early 19th century. A new, larger one is built in the neoclassical style in the 19th century, with its famous landmark of the clock tower that becomes known as Big Ben. Also, the construction of Royal Albert Hall for concert performances, and also the Victoria Albert Museum that showcase many of the possessions of the monarchy and also a lot of the style, but really clutter, of the Victorian period. We also see the development of the famous Tower Bridge, as well as the department store known as Harrods, which became the popular shopping venue for wealthy Londoners. With so much congestion and so many people moving to the city of London in the 19th century, Robert Raikes is concerned about their spiritual welfare, so he invents the idea of Sunday school. These Sunday schools, often the original ones, didn't necessarily meet on Sunday. They could meet in midweek, but they really focused particularly orphan children and children of the working class who may have been neglected during the day, provided them some rudimentary education, as well as some knowledge of the Bible and of the gospel. We also see an attention to children of the working class, particularly boys, by Robert Baden-Powell, who developed the Boy Scouts Association. Powell was concerned about young children not having anything to do in the day and therefore falling into delinquency and trouble and crime during the day, and was also concerned about the unsanitary congestion and crime of major cities like London, and therefore developed the Scouting Association in order to provide opportunities for young boys to leave the cities. There's, of course, great amount of crime and vice in European cities, particularly in London. In the 19th century, we see a legendary explosion of prostitution in London with thousands of London prostitutes. These are often the wives of working class, often widows or young single women who weren't able to earn a livable wage, and therefore to feed themselves or to feed their children, they resorted to prostitution. There are actually guidebooks offering the sale and advertising prices for prostitutes in Victorian London. We also see one of the more notable Victorian Londoners in Joseph Merrick. Joseph Merrick was afflicted with this horrible disease known as elephantitis, and for many years he was part of a freak show in which people would come and pay a small coin to laugh at him in awe at his deformity. And it is not until a London doctor takes him into his care that Joseph Merrick finally achieves any respect in Victorian London. Victorian London is also the famous venue for the murderer Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper was famous for a number of killings in South London. His identity was never confirmed, never realized until perhaps recently through DNA analysis. We may have been able to identify Jack the Ripper as a Polish barber who had worked in that area of London. The other great 19th century city, of course, is Paris. Paris becomes the center of the world, really, in the 19th century. It is the place to be in the 19th century. It is the place to study, the place to learn art or appreciate the arts, and to be in awe of its beauty and all of its pleasures. Paris experiences rapid growth during this time period and becomes famous for its monuments, churches, and also elements of history. Paris before this, at the time of the French Revolution, was really a crowded city. There were many tanneries in the city, and these tanneries often dumped chemicals into the Seine River, thus making the Seine a very polluted and stinky river across the beginning part of the 19th century. With the ascension of Napoleon II to the throne, and the development of the Second Empire, Louis Napoleon commissions Georges Eugene Haussmann for the reconstruction of Paris. The emperor wants a more beautiful city, a city with broader boulevards, and that is one of the priorities of Haussmann, the development of very wide boulevards with very wide, expansive sidewalks, tree-lined avenues that become so common and become so particular to Paris during the 19th century. Therefore, Paris becomes a great walking city. And of course, these policies do beautify the cities with the creation of these very large boulevards, perhaps the most famous being the Champs-Élysées, that connects the Tuileries Palace all the way up to the Arc de Triomphe. We also see the development of the Opera House and tearing down entire blocks of the city in order for the development of these very wide boulevards. Now, these wide boulevards, of course, have an aesthetic purpose, and it makes the city quite beautiful, but they also have a strategic purpose in the sense that they cut down on rebellions and the ability of rebels to blockade entire streets and take over entire blocks of the city, which was certainly much more the concern of Emperor Louis Napoleon. Paris, of course, becomes very famous for its public parks and its broad walking areas. The Paris Opera House is one of the more famous buildings, as is the Gare du Nord train station, which today, through the Channel, can provide passengers a train route to go under the water of the English Channel from Paris all the way to London, England, to Waterloo Station. Paris is also, of course, very famous for its bridges, all of them unique, with a unique design crossing the Seine River. But the most famous institution in 19th century Paris, and becomes probably the most famous landmark in all of the world, is the Eiffel Tower. The Eiffel Tower was developed by Gustave Eiffel, and the purpose of the Eiffel Tower was for the coming of the World's Fair to celebrate France's industrial accomplishments, particularly through the development of its ironwork. However, once the Eiffel Tower is constructed, many people of Paris hated the landmark and demanded it be torn down. But over the course of the World's Fair, because there's such popular acclaim about the Eiffel Tower, people come to love it, even Parisians, and therefore it remains in the city today. It also has a functional purpose as a radio tower, because it's such a high height. It provides an ideal place to put an antenna and therefore broadcast a signal. The Eiffel Tower, of course, is one of the best locations in order to view Paris at night. It is also famous for its very famous diagonal elevators. In Paris, also part of Haussmann's reconstruction of the city, we see the development of the famous advertising columns, and also the introduction of a French police force for Paris, the sergents. So whereas the bobbies are important in London, the sergents are important as a police force to control riots and reduce crime in 19th century Paris. We also see the introduction of public paid toilets and also sewers, which become world famous in Paris and still can be toured by visitors today. Paris is also at the cutting edge of urban technology with the introduction of gas lighting, which required street lighters to light these lamps every night, but nevertheless they provided illumination and also witness a decline in crime as a result of adequate street lighting. And of course, the city is beautified with its very famous fountains and also the introduction of its famous department store, Le Bon Marché. Another major consequence of the age of industrialism was the call for social reform. We see the emergence of several social reformers who are very concerned about the changes to European society because of industrialism. And indeed, many of them believe that the consequences of industrialism are so grave and so significant and negative that they even call for removal from society. We see this particularly with the development of utopian socialism. The idea behind utopian socialism was the idea that cities are so crowded and crime-ridden, loaded with disease, and the industrial way of life is really no way for humans to live, and therefore humans should leave society, leave industrial plants, and also major crowded cities, and create their own utopias or individual societies in which a better form of life can exist. Often these societies or utopias are socialistic societies in which everything is held in common, everything is shared, everyone is supposed to participate equally in the amount of work and the construction of dwellings and the small local economy of the utopia. All of these societies generally fail, though, usually resulting in disputes between participants over the amount of work each individual is doing or inadequate sharing in the products that are being grown. Another response to industrialism also is the emergence of stronger trade unions. We already saw how early in the Industrial Revolution in England, there were combination acts that prevented collective bargaining of workers coming together to negotiate higher wages, fewer hours, and better working conditions. But gradually, over the course of the century, these calls for collective bargaining become more acute, and gradually we see the emergence of trade unions, which come to dominate British politics so significantly at the end of the 19th century that a new political party is formed called the Labour Party. The Labour Party will be successful in getting its first first member elected as Prime Minister of England with David Lloyd George. A more radical response to the Industrial Revolution were the Luddites. The Luddites were concerned about technology taking away their jobs and the emergence of these new machines and how it is changing the British way of life. And so the Luddites were famous for going into some of these plants and actually attacking them, destroying them, as a way of preserving a more traditional way of life. Probably one of the most significant consequences of the industrial age is the emergence of Marxist theory and the publication of the Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto was written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Marx was born in Germany to a long line of rabbis, and he was heavily influenced by the German philosopher Friedrich Hegel. After getting his PhD in philosophy, he moved to Paris and joined the Communist League, the small group in Paris. But it is Marx and Engels' ideas that are consolidated and expanded to become the Communist Manifesto. It's a very short pamphlet produced in 1848, but of course communism or socialism, which extends out of Marxism, is one of the most consequential ideas, particularly going into the 20th century. Therefore, we can take a quick look at the Communist Manifesto. In the early pages of the pamphlet, Marx declares that in order to understand history, we need to follow the money. Indeed, all of history is about materialism. It's about getting goods and services and acquiring wealth. It's not about a divine hand working in history. It's not about people's basic good interests. It's not about principles. It is about the acquiring of money. This contest over money, goods, possessions, wealth leads to a conflict between the haves and the have-nots. As a result, Marx predicts that one day the haves and have-nots are going to launch such a conflict and such a major revolution and war against each other that almost all society will be destroyed, including the means of production. Out of the ashes of this post-industrial order will emerge a perfect communal or communist society, a perfect society where all things are shared, all things are held in common by the workers, and there's not one group to oppress another. Marx says you can see this reality if you look back through history, that in classical Rome, you had a division between the haves and have-nots, with the wealthy patricians versus the lower class of the plebeians. You see it in the Middle Ages with lords and vassals, and now we are witnessing it in the industrial age between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Therefore, Marx said the fundamental problem in industrialized society today is this conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie are, of course, the factory owners, more members of the middle class, not the ancient aristocracy. They're focused on profit, and they have a habit of abusing the workers, according to Marx. The proletariat, these factory workers from the poorer class, live on low wages and despise their owners. So the big 3 points of contention between labor and management, between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, are wages, hours, and conditions, with the proletariat, of course, seeking higher wages, better working conditions, and fewer working hours. Marx predicts in the Communist Manifesto a coming revolution. He says that the proletariat is already being oppressed and that they may launch individual attacks or sabotage, but gradually trade unions are being formed. Government may issue a few reforms to tamp down these trade unions and suppress worker discontent and revolt. But eventually, these reforms will not be enough. A violent revolution is coming, led by the proletariat. The workers themselves will rise up and destroy factories and kill factory owners. And as a result of this violent conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the government eventually will wither away. The proletariat will seize the means of production and produce a perfect classless society, a perfect communist society with no more owners and workers, no more haves and have-nots, and everyone will live in peace and harmony. Now, of course, all the stages of Marx's revolution never comes to fulfillment, but these ideas, of course, will be heavily debated over the course of the rest of the 19th century and definitely into the 20th century with the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the emergence of communist states, and indeed the Cold War itself. The last consequence or response to industrialism we can identify in the artistic movement of Romanticism. Romanticism was a reaction, in many ways, a rejection, or expressed a lot of concern about industrialism. There's a focus to emotion and a celebration of the individual, where everything is becoming much more streamlined and mechanized. There's a quest in painting and in sculpture and architecture for individuality. Indeed, in the literature of the Romantics, they celebrate the solitary hero who's off on his own, able to achieve great things apart from society. The Romantics celebrated the past, tradition, particularly the medieval time period, even Gothic themes. They demonstrate a great love for nature and can be critical of science. This is a very typical painting from the Romantic period from Caspar David Friedrich, Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, the lonely, solitary individual at one with nature, far from the urbanization and crowded cities, far from the industrial plants of the Industrial Revolution. Across the 19th century works of Romantic painters, we see a great attention to nature, a celebration of the medieval past, medieval figures. This was the first time in history that the Middle Ages are actually celebrated, because the Renaissance thinkers, of course, held the Middle Ages in great derision. But now, for the first time in the Romantic period, the Middle Ages, with its closeness to nature, seemed a greater relief than the cities and factories of the 19th century Industrial Revolution. There's a great attention to nature in the Romantics and also patriotism. It can be very nationalistic, as is this painting of the 3rd of May commemorating those Portuguese dissidents who rose up against Napoleon's army. Here they stand heroically in the face of oppression, the oppressive soldiers whose faces cannot be seen. Very nationalistic is Liberty Leading the People, this famous painting celebrating the French Revolution and the commoners rising up and killing the army and also aristocrats. We also see this celebration of the Belgian Revolt. We also see some blurring, shadowing, and blending of colors in Romantic art. Here we see the burning of the House of Commons, almost a lament that this old, antiquated structure is being burned down. But what survives, of course, is the modern bridge next to it. We also see this with this painting of a mill in which the fire and the smog and the smoke fills the air, contaminating nature. And in the foreground, we see a more natural setting, which, of course, is threatened. I think this painting here best summarizes Romantic themes. The fighting temeraire tugged to her last berth to be broken up. Here we see a contrast between blue sky on the left and more urban smoke and smog to the east, a city in the distance on the right side of the painting. And this old ship of sail, this old pre-industrial Navy ship that no doubt had achieved great victories for the empire, is now being pulled by a symbol of modern industrialism, the steamboat, with its putrid smoke blasting from its chimney, pulling this symbol of the past to be destroyed. It represents the conquest of modern industrialism and the destruction of a glorious past. We also see Romanticism in the music of Ludwig van Beethoven, whereas Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was very much an enlightened figure of the Enlightenment and emphasized precision and synchronized beats in his music of the 18th century. Beethoven experimented with much more moods and many more emotions and also unanticipated developments in the course of his symphonies. The beat doesn't always fall at the beginning of the measure, as it frequently does in the works of Mozart. So Beethoven, a conflicted figure himself, brings a lot of his emotion, passion, and anger to his music, which was certainly a significant transition from the past. We also see that in the musical compositions of Felix Mendelssohn. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, a very famous German poet that celebrated nature and the heroic individual, as is the poetry of William Wordsworth. His famous poem Daffodils celebrates nature. Lord Byron was also a famous Englishman who goes to participate in the Greek rebellion and the Greek war for independence, demonstrating that he too is a heroic individual. The novels and poetry of Sir Walter Scott harken back to a previous time, a simpler time before industrialism, that particularly highlighted the accomplishments of his fellow Scotsmen in the past. Hans Christian Andersen, the Danish writer, whose most famous works include The Little Mermaid and Thumbelina and the Emperor's New Clothes. Percy Shelley, the famous poet, and also Mary Shelley, whose most famous composition is Frankenstein. Frankenstein is a great novel to understand the Romantic reaction to industrialism, in which this figure, Frankenstein's monster, this person, is constructed in an industrial way, but indeed becomes the voice of reason and critique of the new mode of life, and calls for a simpler time period, and indeed calls for a return to true humanity and not this new industrialized, mechanized way of life.